So this is the first of a three webinar series we'll be presenting on working in Indian country. Based in Portland, so a lot of the examples I'm using will come from the Pacific Northwest throughout the series. And today we'll be focused on federal Indian policy. Our outcomes for today are how to talk about Indian country and tribal communities. So we'll do a little language work together. And then I'm going to build a narrative understanding of major federal attitudes and policies targeting tribal communities. So my hope is that by the end of today, you'll be able to understand the history of tribes post-colonization, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, and for our government partners, understand how history affects our relationships with tribes today. Let's start with me. I'm the Health and Outdoors Partner at Willamette Partnership. I've got my MPA in Natural Resources and just a couple months ago, actually, wrapped up a certificate in Tribal Relations. But as I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, when you see my face, who the hell do I think I am? I'm white, dude. And I don't think or know of any Native American ancestors. So as a white person presenting on a series of tribal relations webinars, I am a little uncomfortable. But the reason I'm doing this is because I was asked by a tribal partner to lean into that discomfort. And by sharing what I've learned through my experiences working with tribes in the Pacific Northwest and through my schooling, I can reduce the burden on tribes of having to teach other partners these things. And at the same time, I'm also hoping that we can use these webinars to raise some money for an organization that I really love called Changing Currents, which I will send more information about in a follow-up email. So my hope is that all of you who are attending any of these will send some money over their way to actually make an impact toward tribal communities. Before we dive into history, I want to talk a little bit about the language that we use when we're talking about tribes, indigenous folks, Native Americans, American Indians. And I'm sure some of you were maybe a little curious or gasped when you saw the word Indian in the webinar titles. I know for me, before I really started doing work with these communities, I was kind of raised to think that Indian is not really a great word and can be insulting to some of our Native partners. But I want to open with an example of how language is personal, because that will help us understand how we talk about folks when we're talking about tribal communities. So this is a picture of me and my new husband as of a couple weeks ago at our wedding. And before we got married, some people referred to Jason as my partner. And I hate the word partner. It is, I just think it sounds weird. I don't know what it means. And a lot of that is just how I grew up. I grew up in a time when gay people couldn't get married. And so we had to use the word partner because we couldn't say husband or wife. And then after gay marriage was legalized, not too many years ago, partner changed. And I feel like before it was something where, oh, I could understand like you're a queer person because you say partner. Now I want to say husband because I have that ability to get married. I know though, when other people say partner and refer to their significant others as partners, they're not doing it to be annoying or like to co-opt a queer word. They're saying it because maybe they are trying to be more inclusive and have one word that they can use for all different kinds of relationships so nobody feels left out. Maybe they're using it because they don't really like marriage. They don't like the idea of having a husband or a wife, and partner just sits with them better. So I share this example because what I don't like and what I prefer may be super different than what somebody else does. And even though I don't like those words, when other people say them, I'm not offended, but other people might be. So the rule when we're using language is you're always going to piss someone off. So as I'm using different terms and phrases, I understand that some people aren't going to like them. And I just have to kind of accept that. There's no one term I can use for Native Americans or American Indians that everyone is going to prefer. But there are some general rules that we can follow to make sure we're being as respectful and inclusive of other people as possible. So some best practices. The first is tribal members aren't a racial minority, they're a political entity. And so if you take one thing away from our language lesson, I hope is that tribes don't get lumped in with other racial minorities. The reason is tribal sovereignty means that members of tribes are members of sovereign nations. And so that doesn't mean that they don't empathize or sympathize with the causes of other racial minorities who suffer against discrimination. It doesn't mean that they don't have their own history of discrimination against them because of their race and not their political identity. It just means that they are separate things. So within that vein, indigenous is a word that represents their heritage, but not that tribal sovereignty. So in some senses, indigenous is a good word to use because it's more inclusive. So it includes Native Americans who aren't federally recognized. So like folks from Chinook Indian Nation are not a federally recognized tribe, but fall under that indigenous umbrella. It's inclusive of folks who don't necessarily identify with one single tribe. But as a tribal member who I really love says, everyone is indigenous to somewhere. So if you're talking about tribes, you can be more specific and say tribes. And if you want to be broader, you can say indigenous. When you're speaking about specific tribes or people from that, you can be really specific. So for example, if I'm working with Klamath tribes, I can just say Klamath people. And that kind of levels the playing field where I don't have to decide between, American Indian or Native American. It's also pretty common for a lot of tribes to have Indian in the name of their tribes. So for example, Confederated Tribes of Kusla, Umpqua, Sayusla Indians, because it has Indian in their name, generally you can assume it's pretty safe when you're speaking with them to refer to them as American Indians. And then to make a gross generalization, there's also kind of a generational divide upon preferred language in tribal communities. So elders and maybe older folks grew up with the term Indian and accept it. I've heard some of them say they really don't like any other word. They're just Indians. Indigenous tends to be a newer word, mostly in the context I've seen around like activists in the indigenous space or more progressive younger people. And so when in doubt, Native American is usually pretty safe. But again, use those context clues, be specific with who you're talking about. And when in doubt, just ask someone which language they prefer. With that out of the way, let's talk about federal Indian policy. So this is where I'm going to kind of start at the beginning of the United States and bring us up to today and try to tell you a story about how the US federal government has shifted their attitudes over time towards tribes. I want to start with this timeline because to me, it shows how inconsistent the federal government's attitude has been toward tribes over the years. In general, where you see the lines going up over any given era, that's a time when, broadly, generally speaking, it was a good time for the tribes. The federal government was trying to seek out better relationships. They were passing policies that strengthened tribal identity and culture. And then on the flip side, when you see the dots pointing down, those are times when tribes were, again, broadly speaking, really under attack from the federal government. So if you look through, especially the last 100 years, you really just see this like pendulum effect where we'll have some bad years and then a few good years and then some bad years. And if you think of this as a relationship that you'd have with a person in your life, imagine how you would feel if like you had a friend or a family member who you got along with really well and then treated you really terribly and then started treating you well again. And you're like, all right, maybe things are okay. And then it's bad again. And then they're nice to you. having that context can help government partners in particular understand why tribes are a little hesitant, why they're a little weary of working with new partners, because that long history, even though it seems like a long time to us, is not that long in the context of how tribes, how long they've lived in our country. So hold that in the back of your mind while we're talking through each of these individual eras moving forward. Before we dive into the US history, I want to start in the before times. So Constitution was written in 1787, implemented in 1789, but Europeans have been around here for a long time before then. I'm curious if anyone can hop into the chat and tell me who this is a painting of. Anyone? Bueller. Hey, Christopher Columbus. Very good. Oh man, very smart crowd here. Yes, Christopher Columbus. So 1492 was the first European contact here in the Americas. And if you look in this painting, you can see some indigenous people. One is down here in the lower left-hand corner. It looks like this person is explaining something to a European colonist here. And then, very tellingly, you see a group here hiding behind the trees. I think that was a very intentional artistic point, because once Europeans arrived, it was something new and novel for the tribes here. Unfortunately, in some really terrible ways. So even though there wasn't any centralized government here in North America, there were major impacts from initial colonization and discovery. One of which is about 90% mortality estimated. So of all the tribal people in North America, roughly 90% died before the Pilgrims landed. And that was largely because of disease. If you look at this map, it kind of shows you exactly where the US government came in the whole history of colonization. So especially as we think of the Pacific Northwest, there was some initial contact here pretty early on in the 1500s, but then a period of a couple hundred years where there weren't any Europeans anymore. And so for these communities who had experienced this onslaught of disease that, of course, some was passed by very intentionally, through things like infected blankets and such. But as the past year has taught us, you don't need a lot of intention or activity to pass disease amongst communities. So they had suffered these devastating losses and had all this time before the Constitution was actually implemented and the federal government was created. And then to go all the way out to today, we're actually closer to the founding of our country than the founding of our country was to the initial colonization. So even though there was not a lot of contact in that initial couple hundred years, the disease spread and had really devastating effects. And then, of course, the Constitution came along. So we think of before the Constitution, 150 years or so to Jamestown in the 1620. And that was when the Pilgrims, who are like the founders of Americans as we think of ourselves today, came in. Right before the Constitution was ratified, the federal government, which was then organized under the Articles of Confederation, passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this is what opened up the boundary for colonists who had just gone through the American Revolution to expand past the Appalachian Mountains. If we look at this map, up until 1787 in the Constitution's writing, this pink part is where the colonies were limited to. And part of that is before the American Revolution, you were forbidden by the King of England to go anywhere past the Appalachians. So it required special permission from the king to go that far. The Northwest Ordinance opened up the Northwest Territory, which is what we think of today as mostly the Great Lakes region. But before then, all of this pink stuff, or all of the yellow stuff, was pretty much tribal land. There were some French colonies there, but nothing like the dense population along the eastern seaboard. Very telling is the language in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, because it pretty explicitly says, "The utmost good faith shall be observed toward Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent." And that sounds very altruistic, and if we're being generous, perhaps it was. But the reason for that language is that there was an attitude of impermanence from the colonists toward uh, the American Indians. And that was because they had seen their populations be so decimated by disease, even since the colonists came in the 1600s. It's also because when there was conflict, overwhelmingly, it was the colonists who were murdering the indigenous people. And so they just learned, if we move to the west, or forcibly move to the west, we can reduce that area of conflict. But from the federal government's perspective, they just assumed, all right, if we open up this new territory and people move west to the Mississippi, either the Indians will all just die because they're prone to our diseases, or they will just flee even further west. Another thing that happened in this very early founding era was the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. So this is where that supremacy of the federal government relationship to the tribes as sovereign nations was created. And that language says that Congress has the exclusive power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And so this Commerce Clause established that relationship and still remains the primary basis of federal supremacy in relationships with tribes. Finally, we have a bit of a transition in this era. So after the Northwest Ordinance was passed, colonists started moving east. The federal government realized that the Native Americans weren't just disappearing. And so they established the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1824. And it's worth noting that the BIA was established within the Department of War back then, which leads us into the first really dark era of our federal government's relationship with tribes, from 1829 to 1886, which was the removal and reservation area. So during this time, the federal government realized, oh, they're not just disappearing, they're not all going to die out, they're not just going to go where we tell them to go. And there was increased conflict as settlers moved into Native American territory and started taking their land. So the federal government decided the easiest way to squash that conflict was to separate the two. So we'll have an area of land that is for colonists and a separate area of land that is for the Native Americans. This had already happened because as the colonists moved in, they pushed the tribes further out west. But this was the first time there was a really concentrated effort from the federal government to move a huge group of people away from their homelands. This is when things like the Trail of Tears happened. A lot of tribes from the south and southeast were moved out to the Great Plains. Thousands of people died here. If you can imagine, like someone coming to your house and saying, hey, you and your neighbors are all moving. We're going to march you out from Portland to Burns. And you've got about 1 hour to get ready. And that's it. Think of how hard that would be. Just to like wrap your mind around it so quickly. But then for your elderly neighbors, for folks with babies and children, like how do you make that move on foot with little to no supplies and at gunpoint? And it was horrific. There was also, to complement the removal, the government had to set up a place for them to be removed to. And so this is where we see the birth of the reservation system. The reservations from the indigenous perspective is in that word, reserve. So for them, it was pitched as, this is the land that you are keeping for yourself. And you're saying, all right, some colonists can go other places, but we are keeping this land because it's important to us. And as I'm sure most of you know, that's not necessarily how it played out. those reservations were often drawn, especially for tribes that were removed in places that were really far away from where they had lived since time immemorial, but also in climates that were totally different. Imagine moving from like South Florida to Oklahoma. Uh, None of your native foods are there. None of the fish that you're used to having are there. None of the animals that you're used to eating are there. Um, and agriculture wasn't really a way of life for them. They were hunter-gatherers. And so by moving them into these reservations that often didn't have very arable land, that got very cold in the winter, they were also just opening them up to more disease, disconnecting them from their culture and their religions that were very land-based. And it didn't stop the conflict. As much as the federal government wanted to say, you will stay here, you will stay here, colonists didn't respect those boundaries. And so we saw increased conflict as colonists moved into what had been Indian territory. There are instances of Indians attacking like bands of covered wagons and such, but the vast majority of violence was against Native Americans from colonists who, in a time of lawlessness and when they felt like they had this permission from manifest destiny to go and conquer these lands, would just massacre women and children and go into villages at night, because they thought it was a lot easier just to kill them and have them out of the way than to try to build relationships and get along with them. In the Pacific Northwest, this was delayed a little bit, mostly because people weren't out here until the gold rush. So once gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevadas in 1849, you saw a huge influx of folks, mostly young single men, coming out to the West to find gold and to strike it rich. And so as more and more people moved out to the West Coast from the East, the federal government realized, oh, we need some treaties with these tribes to reduce conflict here. And so mostly in Oregon and Washington, we have what are called Stevens treaties. So Stevens was charged with going and getting signatures from the tribes here to set up their reservations and to find land that colonists could then occupy. What Stevens didn't do a great job of was picking neighbors and keeping folks in their ancestral homelands. So for example, this is a picture of the Warm Springs Reservation. And it's gorgeous, right? Beautiful high desert. You've got some really nice ponderosa pines there, gorgeous canyons. What you don't have is a lot of access to fish. And the tribes who were confederated on the Warm Springs Reservation historically had like been up to the Columbia. They had access to Celilo Falls and the Dalles, which was a huge trading center for them, and had followed this like cyclical migrational pattern all around Oregon. And instead, they were lumped to this piece of land that the federal government thought nobody really wants to live here, so we'll just put it there and we'll keep the riverfront property for ourselves. They also confederated tribes that didn't get along, that didn't have great relationships with each other necessarily, that didn't necessarily speak the same language. And so even though you had all these treaties signed, once things shook out, a lot of the indigenous people had to realize that we have to adapt, and we aren't allowed in a lot of these places where we thought we would be allowed in. So what followed after the reservations are all set up, Indians are removed to places so that colonists could have access to the nice land. The federal government realized that that conflict was going to keep happening as long as the cultures were separate. And so because of the treaties, the tribes were guaranteed certain rights by the federal government. Things like access to food, access to healthcare, and access to education. So the BIA was in charge of running schools on each of these reservations that were usually set up by missionaries who also planted their churches there. And within those schools, the federal government realized we have a huge opportunity to seed ideas into the children. And their hope was within a couple of generations, if they could could remove the culture from all of the children on the reservations and indoctrinate them with Western culture, then we wouldn't be having these conflicts anymore. The exact language used was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so what they set up were Indian boarding schools. And these were places where these very disparate tribal communities would send all of their children to as a requirement, and then their children would be punished for speaking their native language, for practicing their religion, for wearing their traditional clothing. They were all given haircuts. They were all dressed in Western garb, taught to write and speak in English. And it was just a very explicit attack on their culture. The Indian boarding schools have been in the news quite a bit in the past year, mainly because of the discovery of mass graves at a couple of boarding schools up in Canada. And they're mass graves of children. And so it's put a focus on the Indian boarding school system that a lot of white culture just has not really known about before. And as horrific as it is, I don't know that it's that surprising to a lot of Native Americans, because they knew that their children were missing. They have known that those places were rife with abuse, and so as we start looking at our schools here in the States, it's likely something that will stay in the news for a while. It's also worth noting that there are some Indian boarding schools that are still operating today, including one in Oregon and Salem and Chemawa. And so in the modern context, they're still very controversial. Obviously, a lot of people find them disturbing and terrible because of their history. There are some people that still choose to send their kids there. And for them, the arguments I've heard for it are education systems on some reservations in the country are so poor that it is worth sending their kids to a boarding school where they can meet kids from other tribes, have access to education, have access to food. But it carries a very long legacy of trauma and harm. So while the federal government figured out this way to attack their culture, what they also then realized was, oh gosh, we actually screwed this up and gave these folks some land that we still want. So they passed the Allotment Act in 1887, also called the Dawes Act. And the Allotment Act was really an attack on group property ownership for Native Americans. So before you had a reservation, it was owned by the group as a whole, and there weren't any private property rights. So the Allotment Act broke up each of those reservations into allotments or specific plots, and each enrolled tribal member would get one of those allotments, and then be able to do with it what they wanted. If they proved their own capacity, they were allowed to sell it or manage it as they wanted. But the government's real purpose here was A, to increase more agriculture on reservation land, and then B, to let white people buy up that reservation land. So after those allotments were given out, there's a lot of land left over. And in a lot of instances, the US government bought it up, but they also opened it up for more settlers to buy. And then of course, once a Native American owned their own parcel, they could sell it. And so a lot of those original allotments were sold to colonists or settlers, sometimes under coercion or threats of death. And so what you had was this checkerboard reservation system where maybe, one ranch here was owned by the tribe, one ranch here was owned by a colonist. And slowly over the course of those about 50 years, the reservations were whittled away as that land passed into settlers' hands. Thankfully, people noticed that that was a bad idea. So here's a picture of John Collier, who was the commissioner for the BIA under FDR, meeting with some tribal folks in the 30s. And so this kind of follows the period of the market crash, New Deal era up into World War II, when the whole country was focused on economic development. John Collier had studied the tribes for a long time before becoming BIA commissioner, and he had made friends with the tribes. He had seen the problems on the reservation and seen all the horrors that both the Allotment Act and the boarding schools had on tribal communities. And so the Indian Reorganization Act that was passed in 1934 was a direct refute and correction to the assimilation and allotment eras. The Indian Reorganization Act was a huge win for tribes because it provided a mechanism for the federal government and the tribes to buy back that reservation land that had been lost during allotments. So that included both surplus land that was still left over and specific allotments that had gone up for sale. And then once that land was repurchased, it could be put back in trust for the tribes. So it was almost a reversal of that checkerboard where they're trying to fill it in a little bit more. It also restored federal recognition of over 40 tribes that had been dismantled by the government before. And that dismantling will play into the next era that we see, which was the Termination Era. So we had that one big pendulum swing after the initial westward expansion, where things were pretty good. We had a terrible, about 70, 80 years for tribes during the assimilation and allotment era, a good like 15 years under FDR. And then to give you a little more whiplash, a horrible 15 years under the Termination Era. So as much as the Indian Reorganization Act was a correction to assimilation and allotment, termination was designed as an exact flip-flop of that reorganization era. So it was basically another attempt at a land grab and assimilation. And so what the federal government through Congress did was pass a handful of termination acts that just negated the treaties that they had initially signed with the tribes. I tend to think of treaties as being like a multi-party agreement where it takes agreement by those parties to disassemble them, but that was not the case. And so along with that termination, what happened was the tribes' land was no longer held in trust by the federal government. In a lot of the cases, it was just taken by the federal government and sold to other people. It also meant that those promises for things like education, access to healthcare, and food would no longer be provided. And so if we think of how much the country changed in that span of a couple hundred years, how so many tribal members were torn away from their homelands and didn't have access to their first foods, removing those resources from them was tantamount to death. It killed their culture, it killed their opportunity for economic development, and caused a mass exodus of folks from reservations into cities where they could then try to build a life in Western culture. This was especially impactful in the Pacific Northwest because the tribes had a lot of resources here. That land where the federal government didn't think a lot of people wanted to live ended up being really rich timberland in some places. And so one of the first tribes to be terminated were the Klamath tribes. And you can see here on this map, the red outline was their initial reservation area, close to 1 million acres of ponderosa pine. And so at the time, the tribes had, I think, the second most wealth built up of any tribe in the country. And the federal government came to them and said, we are going to terminate you, and you can do one of two things. You can either add your name to a list of enrolled tribal members, and you won't get any payout for that. So you can still say, like, I've got a stamp and a badge as being part of this group, or you can say, yeah, I'm cool with termination and I want money for my land. And the government would pay out sums, lump sums, to tribal members who did that. So even though some of these termination acts seemed like they were mutually agreed upon, they were not. It was all coercion. And what happened was once those Indians got those lump sum payments, they didn't have any direction or education of what to do with them. They had been shut out of banking because they weren't allowed to have bank accounts because of their tribal citizenship. In a lot of places, they didn't interact with their neighbors much because they had so much land and resources they could just keep to themselves. So all of a sudden, you have all this money, you don't have access to education or food anymore, so you go into town and you spend it. And in a lot of places, including in Oregon, the white neighbors took advantage of that, and they would just have signs that this is the price for this good if you're a white person, and this is the price for this good if you're an Indian, because they knew there was money flowing. And so what happened is the vast majority of folks who received those payouts blew it within the span of a year or two, and then immediately sent the entire tribe into a very deep cycle of poverty. And because of discrimination in the banking industry and the housing industry and all these other places, they just didn't have access to these basic resources. They weren't able to rebuild their wealth, and their land was stolen from them. If you can imagine having 1 million acres of forest land that you can regularly sell for timber, and then having your reservation reduced to zero, how do you recover from that? And this is not just the case in Klamath. This was the case for 61 tribes in Oregon who were terminated through the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act. So in the Northwest, it was just a devastating time for a lot of the tribes. It's also worth pointing out this was not that long ago. A lot of the folks that I know and have met with remember termination very clearly, and it's pretty traumatic for what it caused for them, their families, and their culture and their tribe. And so as you work with tribal members, it's really important to look up what their recent history has been. A couple of tribes in Oregon got through the Termination Act without termination, largely because they didn't have big resource holdings, and so they weren't targeted by Congress. But before you go into a space, make sure you look up how this era changed their tribe and affected them. I also just want to point out, as a very quick aside, during the Termination Era, Alaska became a state. And so Alaskan Natives are very different than American Indians, both culturally and then also the way they are organized by the federal government. Very briefly, they're organized mostly by as corporations. There's one set up in Washington for the Alaskan diaspora, and then all the others are up in Alaska. And basically, it's a loose confederation based upon geography as far as what resources you have access to. All that to say, if you're working with Alaskan Natives, not a lot of this is relevant, so you need a different webinar. And then the pendulum swings one more time, and thankfully it's in a positive direction. So starting with the Kennedy administration, there was a very real realization that these practices were evil. And even though they had been sold as a way to increase self-determination and give tribal people more personal control over their lives and livelihood, it became very clear that this was not that. It was just a land grab, and it was designed to be destructive. So you had a series of actions passed from Kennedy administration, LBJ, up to Richard Nixon that were really positive for tribes and helped build back their power structure and give them opportunity for economic development. The first of those in the more modern era was the Voting Rights Act. So before the Voting Rights Act, tribes' ability to vote in any election was determined by the states. And as I'm sure you can imagine, not a lot of states wanted Indians voting in their elections. And so the Voting Rights Act changed that and said, even though you might be a citizen of a sovereign nation, you are still a citizen of the United States, and you are still allowed to vote with the same rules and restrictions as everyone else. In 1968, during the Civil Rights era, you also saw the Indian Civil Rights Act. And this was basically a statement that the Bill of Rights from the Constitution also applied in Indian country. So things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of those were very explicitly given to the Native nations in our country. In 1975, old Tricky Dick here passed the Indian Self-Determination Act. And this one act was probably the best thing to happen to tribes in the history of the United States, because it allowed those tribes to make their own decisions for how their resources would be spent and contract their own services from the BIA. So as those treaties were restored during this era to a lot of the tribes, but not all, that were terminated, those rights came back. Things like the right to education and healthcare and food that would be provided by the federal government. So what the Indian Self-Determination Act allowed was a tribe could prove that they had the capacity to deliver those services themselves. And then instead of needing like a BIA teacher to come out to a school, they could just get money and run the school the way they wanted. So as you can imagine, the curriculum changed. And instead of trying to be indoctrinated with Western culture, a lot of tribes were able to then do their own teaching, add cultural elements to the classroom, bring in their own spirituality, and be really specific and have more control over what their kids were taught. The last big act that seems weird, but had a huge impact in Indian country is the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So this was the one that allowed casinos to be brought onto reservations and allowed gambling. And for me, coming from Indiana, which is a place without casinos, it seems like a strange thing when I moved out west. But it's such a specific and novel way for tribes to make money that was really reserved for tribes because it's illegal in most states. It offered them an opportunity for economic development that was distinct from white people. And so because of that, the novelness of gambling, a lot of tribes were able to make a lot of money on their casinos. It's not true for all tribes, to be sure, especially tribes living closer to like metro areas tend to have more people around to spend money than tribes in rural areas. It is also a rumor and not true that every tribe gets a payout from their casino every year. Those payouts are determined on a tribe by tribe basis, and a lot of them don't have them. But it's hard to overstate the impact of that Gaming Regulatory Act on tribal communities and their ability to build their own wealth and have something that was distinct they could then generate income from and put it toward more services, put it toward buying back their land. That takes us up to the present for the most part. That is not to say that things are like whoop-de-doo wonderful all the time for tribes. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, even more recently in the last 30, 40 years, we can think of things like the fish wars, where there was just very clear animosity toward tribes and their rights to hunt and fish. Things like the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement has highlighted how that violence toward especially Native women has not ceased or abated and is often overlooked by our federal government. But by and large, from a federal policy standpoint, we're at the best place we've been since our country's founding. And to quote one tribal member, "Today is really the best time to be an Indian since white people got here." And I think that's evidenced by the fact that all of you are here today. It's evidenced by the fact that Oregon and Washington have directives from their government to have relationships with every agency and their local tribes. And so this renewed interest and vigor in tribes, the money that is flowing to them, our desire as a culture to seek out information and understand what was wrong and how we can help is evidence of that growing movement toward compassion and better relationships with the tribes. So that ends the formal part of our presentation today. I encourage anyone to ask questions if you want to. I'm not necessarily an expert by any means moving past here, but would be happy to answer anything you've got for the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, thanks, Barton. I see Mary has her hand up, so I'm going to allow her to talk, and then we got a couple questions in the Q&A and chat to answer as well. So,
awesome.
Mary, let's see here.
Hey, Mary. We can't hear you if you're speaking. But it's also lunchtime, so maybe she's getting a sandwich.
In the meantime, Barton, do you want to answer a couple of questions that are floating in chat in the Q&A? Can you see those?
Yeah, let me pop into chat first. Marwa asked, were the Stevens Treaties presented in English? And is there evidence of any translators for the signing of Stevens Treaties? Um, yes, they were presented in English. Translators kind of differed from place to place. So it's really hard to look back at that era and to be able to know like who understood what they were signing for, and who didn't. Uh, and it probably differs from treaty to treaty. So I'd encourage you to look back at the language. It's pretty standard and they're not super long, from one place to another. But what I didn't necessarily talk about is how those initial reservations from the treaties were whittled down over the years. So part of that happened during allotment, um, but a lot of it has happened like during the termination era. A lot of times those maps were just redrawn. So if you look at things like the Siletz Reservation, and Grand Round Reservation. Both of those were much larger when those treaties were initially signed. And then folks came back and said, well, no, actually, like the map was drawn here, so we're going to move you further. I'm like, no, actually, the map was drawn here, so we'll move you further. So the treaties had some important rights that were very specific and probably were communicated, but they also were not treated, and honored properly by the federal government, regardless of whether the folks who signed it understood what they were signing. Let me hop into the Q&A. Noah asked about the tribal relations certificate. Yes, totally recommend it. Got from PSU. They are offering signups right now for the new cohort to start in December. And if anyone has any questions, shoot me an email and I would love to rave to you about how much I love that program. Someone asked the current status of the Klamath tribe today. So the Klamath tribes were restored decades later. And up until maybe a year ago, I think their land holding was only around 300 acres, but they just purchased a pretty large parcel outside of town that is important cultural land for them. So they're growing. And they're just delightful people. If you get a chance to work with Klamath tribes, love them to death. Lanan asked if I have any recommendations for books to read about Oregon tribes, and I do. The number one recommendation I have for folks working with tribes in Oregon is a book called The First Oregonians. It came out, I think, through OSU's press. Very easy to find on Amazon or at Powell's or anything. And the cool thing about it is it's got a chapter on each federally recognized tribe that was written by that tribe themselves. So not only is it a really good place to understand their history and their culture, it's a really good way to understand it from their perspective. And as you read the whole thing, you can also kind of get a vibe for each tribe a little bit, just based upon the different ways they write and what they share. Tom asked if I can comment on the recent changes to statewide education requirements regarding education about Indians, and kind of. Oh gosh, I don't know if I'm going to remember the actual bill number, but I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 now, the legislature passed a bill that required K through 12 education, I think in all subject areas, to incorporate Indigenous education, which is super cool. But as you can imagine, building out that curriculum and getting it implemented can be a challenge. So there are some great groups that have done some work around basic curriculum training that if you go to the, I think it's the Oregon Society of Social Studies Education or something like that. There are a lot of S's in the acronym. They have a lot of great tools with example lesson plans and ways you can incorporate that education throughout all different subject areas. Hannah asked, oh my gosh, you guys, questions. If I can describe the nature of the relationship between tribes and the federal government. Federal government is higher power, or are they on equal footing as sovereign nations in negotiations? And my answer there is, depends on who you ask. So in theory, they would be on equal footing. The tribes are distinct sovereign nations, and they operate within the United States and have that supreme relationship with the federal government at level. If you look at history and how that's played out, it is not on equal footing, and the federal government pretty often runs ramshot over the tribes. But that changes from administration to administration. It changes from tribe to tribe and region to region. So if we think of that pendulum again, that might help you understand kind of what that relationship is like. I didn't get into any of like the judiciary or Supreme Court cases that were really important for Indian country, but the phrase that I'm thinking of, and I'll have to look through my notes and remind myself of which justice said it. But the tribes were defined as domestically dependent nations. And that phrase, domestically dependent nations, I think captures the federal government's attitude toward tribes the best. I'm not saying it is right, because I don't think it is. But the way I think it's Justice Marshall described it, basically means that tribes are kind of their own thing, but also they are dependent upon the United States for a lot of things. And if you look at the treaties and those rights that I've mentioned, that kind of colors in what that dependency looks like. But if you also look at the history of reservations, and even today, a lot of those basic services just aren't provided. And so the tribes are dependent upon the government because they were never given the capacity or the land or the resources to be able to really thrive in the places they were moved to. Emily, I might need your help fielding some of these. Senate Bill 13. Thanks, Tom. Are there any initiatives that tribes are currently pushing for to change federal policy? Oh yeah, all the time. There are a lot of confederations of tribes. So like in the Pacific Northwest, we have the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. And what those are, they're membership-based organizations that are pan-Indian. So they're all the federally recognized tribes. I think they also maybe invite non-federally recognized tribes into those. And they have working committees on things like natural resources, on energy, on gaming, that are designed to build policy playbooks that they want to present to the federal government. Sometimes those things are more specific. So if we're looking at like pipelines, for example, especially in Dakota, those are really specific, high profile federal policy changes they want to push for. Sometimes they're a little quieter and more behind the scenes and more technical. But those groups tend to be the ones who draw out those bigger picture federal policies instead of like a tribe by tribe approach toward changing federal policy. Let's see. Examples of federal government having to defer to tribes in natural resource decision making, around ESA implementation as an example. That's a really good question. And honestly, I think what has probably been most impactful there is the courts. So if we look at like around the fish wars, some of those court decisions that showed tribes have a right to, for example, like 50% of salmon runs, no matter how low they are, because of their treaty rights. That was really impactful for the tribes and kind of forced the hand of folks like Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to work more closely with the tribes, because they weren't just allowed to say, you're not allowed to fish here or harvest here. We have to work with you. And I also think there's been a movement, and maybe I'm being a little optimistic here, from state agencies and federal agencies to engage tribal input more meaningfully. You know, when we think of like traditional ecological knowledge and some of those other terms that aren't new but are entering the public lexicon in a new way, I just think there's a growing movement, especially in the Pacific Northwest, to include tribes more meaningfully in decision making around natural resources. This might be a stretch for you, but do you know about the tribes that were moved into Canada and how they are doing in comparison to those that remained in the US? Know what happened with tribes in Montana, because this attendee's great-grandfather was a lawyer for them, and it's very specific. It is, and I don't know, honestly. It's hard to talk about like pan-Indian movements, especially modern times, because each tribe is different. So like even if you look in Oregon, for example, there are a couple tribes who have really built out their capacity and infrastructure a lot, even like the last 30 years, because of that Regulatory Gaming Act. And so they're able to bring in some serious money to their community and put it toward big initiatives because of that economic driver. But then you've got smaller tribes who are in much more rural areas who just don't have that capacity. And so even within Oregon, I would say you can look at some tribes who are at least economically doing better than others. And so it probably depends for those tribes. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Barton. We've got 2 minutes left. So I just wanted to note, as many folks have put lots of great resources and links in the chat, that we will send out a lot of those after the webinar. And we are recording this, so this will be available online to the public as well if you didn't make it. And then we have 2 more of these to follow, which maybe Barton, you might want to touch on of what's to come.
Yeah, so our next session is going to be around land acknowledgements, which I know are kind of a hot button thing, both inside Indian country and outside of. So that one will be fun. My goal is to help you better understand the purpose of them and how to implement them in a thoughtful and respectful way in your organizations. And then the last one will be focused on working in Indian country. So that's just going to be some really practical tips, particularly helpful for government partners, but also nonprofits, for how do you approach a tribe to start building a relationship, and what should you expect when you start working on a project with a tribe. So knowing that we're wrapping up, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Would love to talk. And we'll be sending out that follow-up email with more information about the following webinars, as well as that link where you'll be able to donate to Changing Currents. So thank you so much. Super stoked to have such a great turnout today, and have a lovely rest of your Wednesday.